into the nervous system that we are going to study in case of human beings. Now, we would be first studying about some very important terms. Now, the first term is neuron. Now, this nervous system, which is existing in case of animals, that nervous system comprises of millions of neurons. Though they are considered as the functional units. So these neurons, they are the specialized cells which are considered as the structural and the functional unit of the nervous tissue, and they help in receiving the stimulus, and they also help in conducting of this impulse and transmitting the impulse to the other neuron. So that is a function which is being done by this neuron. Now, apart from that, we are having some terms like stimulus. Now, what do you understand by this term that is stimulus? Stimulus means, if we can say as any internal or external, any change in internal or external environment, okay, that can be said as your stimulus. Now, any change in external and internal environment which is making an organism to show a response to that particular change, that is called as your stimulus. Plural is stimulant. Now, we are also having a term which is called as response. Now, what is response? Response means a kind of action which you are showing towards a particular stimulus. So, we can say an action towards a stimulus, that is called as response. Now, apart from this, we are also having the term that is called as receptors. Receptors means what? Receptors means these are certain cells, tissues or organs which are going to receive the impulse or receive the stimulus. So that is why they are said to be receptors. Like we are having 5 sensory organs who are having these receptors in these organs to receive something. Okay. So then we also have the term which is called as the effectors. Now, what do you understand by this term that is effector? These effectors, they are referring to certain cells, tissues or muscles of the glands which are going to show a response. Receptors will receive the stimulus. The effectors will show a response towards a particular stimulus. That is called as your effectors. They are generally your muscles or your glands. Now, apart from that, what is the function of this nervous system? This nervous system, it is helping in controlling all the body functions. It is coordinating whatever functions are going on in your body inside, which is not under our control. Voluntarily, you don't have any control over these functions, so they are being controlled by this nervous system. Apart from that, they are also helping an organism or enabling an organism to show a particular response towards a particular stimulus. Like suppose when you are touching a particular hot object, you are instantly removing your hand. Why is it occurring as such? Because you are having these receptors present on the skin who are detecting it. They are sending the message to the nervous system, and thereby you are showing a response to it. So all these are the few terms which we would be coming across every now and then when we will go through this chapter. Now, moving on to the next, as I said you, neuron is said to be the structural and the functional unit of living organisms or of the nervous tissue. Now, when it is considered as the structural and the functional unit of the nervous system or the tissue, then how does it look like? You can see here, this is the structure of a neuron. The neuron is having 3 main parts, and what are they? We can write that the 3 main parts of this neuron. The first one is dendrite, second cyton, and the third is axon. So what is this and what are the functions of them? Let us take on. Now, dendrites, as you can synapses are called as your dendrites. Now what is the function of the dendrites? Dendrites are the ones who are going to receive the impulse. So they are going to receive the impulse. Whatever changes are occurring, they will be receiving them. So dendrites are meant for receiving. So we can say the function of dendrite is to receive the impulse. And after receiving it, it is going to direct it towards the cyton. So you can see this part, the central part, this is called as your cyton. Otherwise, it is also called as your cell body. Now in this cyton only, you will find the presence of nucleus and several other cell organelles. Now this cyton, since it is having the nucleus in it, so it is set to control all the activities of this neuron. So whatever activities are being done by this neuron, that is, or the metabolic activities, conduction, everything is under the control of this cyton. Moving on to the next part, which we have this thread-like structure, which you can see, elongated structure, which is arising from the cyton. That is called as your axon. So you can see this elongated part which is coming out from the cyton, that is called as your axon. Now what is this axon doing? Axon is carrying the impulse away from the cyton. So dendrite is bringing the impulse towards the cyton and axon is carrying the impulse away from the cyton. So we can mention axon's function is it carries impulse away from cyton, whereas dendrite is bringing it towards cyton. Now you can see here these axons, they are having these sheet-like structures which are called as myelin sheath. Now and in between these myelin sheath is not continuous. At places they are having they have stopped and again one place they have again arise. Now here this particular part you can find a little gap between the two myelin sheath. That is called as your node of Ranvier. So what happens? The impulse, if suppose a neuron is in such a way, the impulse just jumps from one node of Ranvier to other node of Ranvier, which help in easy and faster conduction of the nerve impulse. Now, this axon, it is ending. These parts you can see, they are called as your nerve endings or your axon terminals. Now, these axon terminals, what happens is, here all throughout from the dendrite to the axon ending, the impulse is traveling in an electrical form. Now, when it needs to travel from one neuron to another neuron, the end parts of the neuron, that is, suppose this is the nerve ending of one neuron and this is the dendrite of another neuron, they are not in physical touch with each other. There exists a small gap between the two neurons and that gap is called as synapse. So synapse, we can say a functional junction between the two neurons. Now what happens is, in the nerve ending, the impulse which is traveling in electrical form in the nerve ending, they will be getting converted to your chemical form. So in the synapse, we can find there is the presence of neuromuscular or neurotransmitters which help or which is containing the information in form of your chemical impulse. So here in the nerve ending, it is converting the electrical impulse to your chemical impulse so that it can again be perceived by the dendrites of another neuron and the impulse can travel along the neuron. Now, these neurons which we are studying, there are three types of neuron. And what are the three types of neuron? We are having, the first one is sensory neuron. Now, types of neuron. The first one, sensory neuron. What is it doing? Sensory neuron is going to carry or receive the impulses and it receives the impulses and send it to whom? Send it to the CNS. So, sensory neuron carries impulse and sends it to the CNS. Now, if we say it is carrying impulse from whom? It is carrying impulse from the receptor. So we started, what are receptors? So they are carrying receptors. They are supplied with the sensory neurons. These sensory neurons, they will carry the impulse from the receptors and they will send it to the CNS. Now moving on to the next type of neuron, that is your motor neuron. Now what is this motor neuron going to do? Motor neuron is going to carry the impulse from the CNS and sends it to the effector. So who is carrying the impulse from the receptor? That is your sensory neuron. Who is carrying the impulse to the effector? That is your motor neuron. From where are they collecting these impulses? They are carrying these impulses from the CNS. Who is bringing? It is being brought about by sensory. Again, motor neuron is carrying out from them. Now, the third neuron which we have is relay neuron. Now, what is this relay neuron going to do? Relay neuron is going to transmit the message between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron. So, transmit the message between sensory and motor neuron. So that is called, that is the function of your relay neurons. Now moving on to the next, now we would be studying about the reflex action which is brought about in our body. Now we are having reflex action. Now what do you understand by this reflex action? Reflex action means any sudden or immediate response which is being shown by an organism towards a particular stimulus, that is called as reflex action. Suppose, take for example, when you are touching a hot pan, you are immediately removing your hand without even thinking. You are immediately, instantly, in few seconds only, you will be removing your hand. So that is called as a reflex action. So these reflex action, they are very sudden, immediate responses which are shown towards a particular stimulus. Now, these reflex action, they follow a pathway which is called as reflex arc. So what can we say about reflex arc? The pathway which is followed, during reflex action by sensory and motor nerves. So they are said to be your reflex arc. That pathway is called as your reflex arc. Now, this reflex action we can write sudden and immediate response to a stimulus. That is called as a reflex action. Now, what is the path what are the components of this reflex arc and what pathway is being followed by these sensory and motor nerves? Let us understand that. Suppose a stimulus is coming. We are having the receptors. Now these receptors, they are, from the receptors you have the sensory neuron who are carrying the impulse from the receptors to the spinal cord, and again the spinal cord is deciding what kind of action you are going to show towards a particular stimulus. So it is being brought about by the motor neurons to the effectors, and then the effectors are showing a response. So this is the pathway which is being followed during a particular reflex action. So since this pathway is involving the spinal cord, So we can say that this reflex is your spinal reflex. Okay, so this is what is the function, or this is what is happening in the reflex action. Now I said you about receptors. Receptors, they are going to receive. Now we are having 5 sensory organs. Now these receptors are present on those 5 sensory organs. Now let us look into the different types of receptors which we have in our body. Now the first sensory organ, let us consider eye. Now eyes, they are having all photoreceptors. So the eyes have photoreceptors to detect what? To detect the light. We have ears, and they are having the receptors which are present in the ears. They are said to be phonoreceptors, which are going to detect the sound and which help us in hearing the things. We have the next sensory organ, which is tongue, and they are having gustatory receptors, and these gustatory receptors, they are the ones who are meant for the tasting of the food. Now apart from that, we also have nose, and nose, they are having the olfactory cells. So we can say they have olfactory receptors to detect the smell of the different things. Now we have the next most wide and the most largest organ, that is the skin. Now the skin has detectors like thermoreceptors, which detects the hotness and the coldness of the objects. On the skin you also have touch receptors, that is also called as tactile. We also have the pain and the pressure receptors present in the skin. So these are the different receptors which we have in our body, and this is what is about the reflex arc and reflex action. Now we are going to study about the classification of human nervous system.